Hello, everybody. So, welcome to Lunchtime BABLing. As you might have noticed, I'm someplace else. My name is Shea. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for ethical risk, good governance, disparate impact, and bias. And I'm calling you from Belgium. So I'm in Brussels now. And so hopefully the internet is stable. It's the hotel room. And I just came back from, or just finished, a conference on algorithmic auditing. And so what I'm going to do is just sort of debrief a little bit, some notes from that conference, a little bit about what I saw and what it was like, and sort of how I think the field is starting to change. So why am I in Brussels? So I'm in Brussels because I was invited nicely by the company Eticas. So Eticas is a consulting or an algorithmic auditing firm, rather, from Spain in Barcelona. And actually, they're very similar to BABL in a lot of ways, sort of the European version of BABL. They've been around for quite a while now, for 10 years, and they've been auditing algorithms for 5 years. And they wanted to get together a group of people who work in algorithmic auditing, both from the practitioner perspective, which is why I'm here, and also from the civil society and nonprofits and regulators. And so the group that was assembled had, I was here, there were people from Data and Society, there were people from Twitter or ex-Twitter, people from University College London, groups from Cambridge, the Ada Lovelace Institute. And so we first met in Barcelona a couple days ago and had a sort of a series of roundtable discussions. And the main goal was to try to identify what are the critical issues in algorithmic auditing. So, now that audits are becoming a real thing and there are legal mandates for algorithm audits, how do we proceed as a field? Because the fact is that different groups conceive of and produce algorithmic audits or conduct algorithmic audits in different ways. And so they wanted to get us together and try to figure out, is there some common ground? What can we learn from each other? And what kind of message do we want to give to regulators? And so we started in Barcelona. We had this roundtable, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then we all flew to Brussels to talk to the European Parliament members, and that was yesterday and today, to sort of present a united front, just let them know that we're here as a community, and that algorithmic auditing is an effective tool for AI governance. It's one tool among many, and to give them some of our thoughts on what are the critical things that we need to include and not miss out on in order to actually make this a reality. So some of the things that we talked about, and let me say a caveat here, there are a lot of people in this community that were not there at all. And so this was a relatively small conference. And for a number of reasons, there are a lot of people in this community who just couldn't make it, or weren't discovered in time, or just weren't here. And so, we don't speak for the entire algorithmic auditing community by any means. However, we did talk about our methodologies, the kind of things we find important, things that we found from practice that were critically important. And we kind of came up with a few things that were really, that were common ground and that we found were important. And the first one, and maybe the most important one amongst the group in terms of the strongest cohesion, was the idea of socio-technical auditing. And so the way that auditing or conformity assessments in Europe are being conceived of, in some cases, they are thought of as a very much a checkbox exercise. And so in particular, this idea of sort of self-assessment, where there's sort of just a checklist of things and you just make sure you do those things and you check the box. and then you're done. And oftentimes they're kind of focused on, or they can be focused on the technical portions. So bias, which we all know is extremely important, or robustness or accuracy of the system, of, looking at the training data and making sure that that's diverse and that sort of thing. Those are all very important things, but there's a lot more to risk and risk of harm beyond that. And everybody at this group unanimously said that in their practice, they've realized that socio-technical connection between the algorithm and how people use it and what sort of decisions get made and how they get made, that's really important. And so that's something that we don't want forthcoming laws, which might get enshrined, for instance, in Europe, we don't want them to miss out on this sort of critical piece. And so socio-technical assessments, where it's not just the technical portion, but there is a much broader holistic approach. Everyone in this group, at least, agreed that that was something that had to be included. Another thing that we all agreed on was the notion of sort of public by default. So there is a worry that some sort of practices akin to auditing, let's say like internal audit, so a self-assessment, may become a very private thing that doesn't get published, or that external audits, for instance, there's just some sort of stamp and then there's no public display of what's being shown. We all agree that we don't want that. And I mean, especially civil society really spoke up and said one of the main goals, and this is actually another thing that arose, but they're connected, it's connected with this public by default. One of the main goals of these audits is to allow people who are affected by these algorithms some sort of recourse, some ability to peer into the system and understand whether they've been harmed or wronged in some way. And so by making things private, where you just get a stamp of approval, or you go through a conformity assessment and nothing is public, that doesn't work. And civil society, kind of unanimously amongst this small group, were against that. They would like to allow, they want public results. Now, it doesn't have to be everything, but something has to be made public so that people can understand how the system works and understand whether they've potentially been harmed by the system. And there are a number of things. So independence was also something that was brought up as potentially something that we would align on. That's still not 100% obvious that we all agree on what level of independence audits should have. And the terminology in particular was one thing that I think there was a lot of disagreement. So, what we consider an audit, what we call an audit, versus a sort of regulatory inspection versus an assessment, that's still not settled as a community. And so that's something that I think we're going to have to work on and sort of refine, and there will have to be some kind of standards so we have a common language at least. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't call things two different things an audit, and they are different things, but it helps to have conversations when we know what we're talking about. So we had this meeting in Brussels, in Barcelona rather, and so that was amazing. We had a public event afterwards that was broadcasted, talking about sort of what we had discussed. And then we came to Brussels, and where I am now. And in the past 2 days, we've been meeting with several European Parliament members, MEPs, that are really interested in the AI Act in particular, and the Digital Services Act, the DSA, and the digital package, which is sort of all of these regulations that are being put together around the use of AI and the way people interact with data online. And so that was a really illuminating experience. It was, I mean, one thing I can say is that they're very engaged. So the people that we met with, they listened, and I felt like they really appreciated the urgency of this issue. And the main message, I think, so we gave them the messages that the sort of core things that I just mentioned. And the message that we tried to give to them is that these things have to be, you have to avoid enshrining things in law that keep these, the ability to do socio-technical audits or have public audits or adversarial audits. So that was another thing which I forgot to mention, is that another thing that came up is providing some safe harbor for people who want to make good faith external adversarial audits. So the ability to interrogate systems from the outside and to just as a check on whether everything is working fine, despite the fact that there might be some internal auditing that happens and some external third-party auditing. Let's give activists a chance to actually interrogate these systems from the outside and be protected without fear for having, running into trouble. And I think this is a good thing. And we all sort of agreed that was a critical piece. Part of it is because this whole field started from activism. And so, none of us would be here if activists hadn't been pushing on this issue and asserting their rights. And so to sort of block out that sort of effort as things, we start progressing towards hard law in this area is not something we want. And so that was another mess we had. So the Parliament members were very engaged. They were very interested, and they're also looking for solutions. Like they noticed that there's an enforcement gap. It happened with GDPR, where it took a very long time. There are still a lot of people who are not compliant with GDPR. It's difficult to figure out how, who those people are and enforce the law. And, we were presenting auditing as a part of the solution for this, where you have to build in you have to check people's homework essentially. And so even though there are a lot of requirements in what is called the AI Act around AI, about the documentation you have to keep and the risk management system you have to have, the self-assessment is probably not going to be enough. This is in our opinion. In order to really enforce this, you don't want it just to be a documentation exercise. You want it to actually inform practice within the companies. And so having some sort of monitoring mechanism like auditing built in, that is important, to make sure it has teeth and that it's not just a checkbox exercise. The current conformity assessments, as they're currently written, do have language that allow for the notified body who would do these conformity assessments to check, look in at the data, make sure that run more tests. But at the moment, it's still sort of focused technically. And what we're interested in, making sure that we ensure that the socio-technical aspects are also checked in a similar way, that there's agency for these conformity assessments to actually look at how well they've done the risk management in a real way, the ethical risk management, the safety risk management, and in the way that's protecting fundamental rights. And so I think that the people that we talked to were open and receptive to this idea, but the devil's in the details. And so now, I think it feels like algorithmic auditing is sort of in a turning point. There's a lot of activity in the US, especially. Activity in Europe is really rising. And so these communities, hopefully these communities are all going to be getting together and start sort of figuring out exactly what we want to present to the world in terms of how important audits are and what they might look like, and set some sort of basic standards so that we can ensure that they're effective tools for AI governance and protecting people, and they're not just used sort of as a tick box exercise or some sort of rubber stamp. And I think we all agree that's a good thing, and we want to make sure that gets promoted and pushed. And so we're going to keep in touch. I think this is just the start of a conversation. And so overall, I had a really good experience. I think it was very fun, and there aren't many algorithm auditors out there. And so to get a chance to talk to a group of them who actually work with clients and have done audits and have done risk assessments and impact assessments and bias assessments, it's really great to sort of build that community. So I'm going to take questions. Let me look at the Q&A and see if there's anything here. Okay, so we've got one question that says, what should a socio-technical audit look like? Yes, so yeah, socio-technical audit. So this is, so I've talked about risk assessments before, and a socio-technical audit, well, this is part of what the debate is, like exactly what you want to call an audit. I think if you have the word audit in it, in some sense, you are checking against a standard. So you are assessing the work that somebody did against a standard. But I think that, I mean, the group of Eticas, I think, feels more that audit should be what we would call an ethical risk or impact assessment, which is very holistic end-to-end, where you're looking at everything. And this is something that we do as a company. And so the main bit is the socio-technical bit. And so if you want to, let's try to combine these concepts in terms of standards and also this end-to-end. I think what it ultimately is going to boil down to is that we have to set up a set of standards that constitutes what is an appropriate assessment of the potential for an algorithmic system to cause harm, and what are the appropriate controls that need to be in place to prevent that. And then we have to ensure that people in organizations adhere to those standards. And so the socio-technical bit is, instead of just saying you need to have an accuracy of such and such, and you need to test for bias across a bunch of different protected categories, which absolutely you have to do, we have to ensure that doing a risk assessment is also something that you do. And the risk assessment has to have certain standards associated with that. And we have to check that those standards have been met. And whether it's you do it internally as a company, or you hire somebody else to come in and do this risk assessment for you, that doesn't matter. We don't care. What we care about is that there is some assessment which includes that socio-technical connection. The things that we have noticed are so important for risk, for disparate impact, for potential to sort of infringe on people's fundamental rights. And so I think the socio-technical audit is a set of those standards and the process by which you ensure that people live up to those standards. All right, so I think we are, let me check, see if there's anything else in here. All right, so question about technical risks. So socio-technical risks. So here's a good example. So the question is sort of, technical risks make sense, but what about socio-technical risks? Socio-technical risks are ones that typically involve people, and it could be anything from how are people labeling or gathering training data, and so the sort of social aspects of that, the political aspects of that, to what are the biases that a person might have as they interact with the outputs of an algorithm. So an algorithm will give you some output. You have to make some decision based on that. In some cases, it could be automatic, but oftentimes there's a human to mediate that. And in fact, explicitly in the AI Act, they're recommending that there be a human in the loop at the end for high-risk systems. And socio-technical says, what are the risks associated with how people understand how that algorithm works? Or, and it could be anything from like, how does the user interface sort of nudge people in particular directions, or can you get a user interface that's going to sort of wake people up to their own biases and make sure and try to mitigate potential sort of cognitive biases they might have. And so these are all things that are important, that the way the algorithms interact are important. And so that's the socio-technical audit, or the socio-technical risks rather, are lie at that intersection. And there are many, many of them. And we talk about some of these. We have some papers which I can link to the sort of the YouTube channel, and talking about sort of the types of risks that we found, the socio-technical risks that we found. The NIST AI risk management framework also does a great job sort of outlining the types, the variety of risks, many of which are socio-technical, which I think was that's a great step forward for a body like NIST to recognize those sorts of things. And there are a lot of really smart people working on that. And so, yeah, I think that's where the meat of this is. The meat of this whole conversation is that we can't just focus on the technical, and we have to find some way to be specific enough that you can set up a standard, but broad enough that you can capture some of these socio-technical risks, which are nuanced and difficult to find. And that's the challenge that we have, and hopefully we can figure out how to overcome that challenge. All right, been great. My apologies for calling from a random hotel room. Thank you for joining in, and I'll see you next Thursday.